This chapter was pretty crazy. I mean, the Raian stocks are probably skyrocketing. They're probably around the same level as where, Setsuna's stocks were while he was beating up Nico's ass, and Nico's coins were plummeting because, oh man, especially with the connector parallel of sorts, which is at the end of the chapter. But because my new format of reviewing the chapter has, somewhat being successful, I'm going to be sticking with it at least for now, and the chapter name is called Messenger. And it starts off with, of course, where we left off in the last chapter when Raian hit William in the gut while letting go of Oteka Maru. We pick up right after that point where Raian is basically explaining to William that Oteka Maru isn't really the source of his power, or specifically that he isn't relying on Oteka Maru. Oteka Maru is simply a tool, and this is something I talked about in my chapter review, at least my last chapter review, where I talked about the fact that Raian was probably not going to become a swordsman, and considering William's comments about Raian being an amateur swordsman as well, it was safe to conclude that Oteka Maru was probably the means by which Raian was going to obtain more power, and so there were probably going to be some benefits. I predicted that it would be an all-around stat boost of sorts, but that's not quite it. It's actually something a bit more fundamental, which goes into the principles level of power, let's say, or mastery, but we'll get to that very soon. William then notes that, of course, his stamina in Guhan doesn't really improve, but he still has the upper hand, given his superhuman syndrome and his 100% Guhan release, and notes to the fact that Raian isn't using his release or removal, even though he knows for a fact that he does have a 100% removal at his disposal, but he decides to actually take Raian out as soon as possible by unleashing the Wu Clan ultimate technique. Honestly, the Wu Clan, just to talk about the Westwood faction for a second, I did talk about this being a problem with Edward. There is a very short amount of techniques that the Westwood faction actually use, at least in terms of Edward, and of course we're getting one with William right now, but that's just something I wanted to talk about, a small little rant on the Westwood faction. At least that's the only gripe I really have with them. However, we get to see what this ultimate technique actually is, and we get to see what Raian has improved with. First, William actually tries to pull a feint on Raian, but Raian doesn't fall for it. He stands completely still, staring at William. It seems like he's trying to see something. Then after that, William's palm actually stops short of Raian's face, and he then unleashes a heavy right. But unfortunately for William, Raian counters that with a nasty kick to the face. Let me just say that. And which completely staggers William Wu. But Raian is actually not done yet, because he actually creeps up behind William, with William trying to launch a counterattack towards the back left side of him. But of course, Raian is able to completely dodge that and lands a devastating hit, one of the Kurei family tradition techniques over here, and that is the depth charge, which seems to do a lot of damage to William. And it is at this point in which Raian does what he does best: talk a lot of shit to William, talking about how his strength is ultimately useless for nothing more than grappling. And it seems like this is bait for Raian, because William wasn't actually trying to grapple him before this point, but seems to actually do that when Raian calls him out on his strength. And when he does that, he goes in for a tackle. However, Raian manages to actually catch William while he's tackling him, and while he's actually got him, I forgot what type of lock this is, but it's a headlock of some sort. He then begins to slander William again while noting the fact that Raian actually knows two people that are more beefier than William Wu. Now, what he means by this, I'm guessing he means more strength or are stronger or have stronger muscles than William. And this should at least put the Wakatsuki and Julius stands to rest at the very least, because, well, it seems as though despite the fact that William has superhuman syndrome and 100% Gohan, he hasn't really reached the levels of Wakatsuki and Julius, at least in terms of strength, at least going by Raian's opinion as well. We don't know whether he is trying to mess with William here or if he is being genuine in what he has said. However, Raian then throws William out of his tackling, and it is at this point that William is beginning to wonder how Raian is overpowering him, despite the fact that he isn't even using removal at all. However, he sees Otekamaru right next to him and decides to use the blade. However, when he tries to pick it up, the blade itself actually sinks, which is a big deal considering, of course, all the strength that William actually has at his disposal. And it is at this point that we get the revelation of what Raian has been doing with Otekamaru. And he actually explains why it's so difficult to actually wield the blade, which makes me think that it's more than likely that the scar on Raian's face might actually come from Otekamaru. I'm thinking that is probably what happened, because it seems to line up with everything we know about Otekamaru, and that is the fact that, of course, it weighs about 20 kilos, or over 20 kilos actually. But not only that, the weight is actually distributed unevenly as well, which makes it even harder to actually wield this blade. And so, in order to wield this blade effectively, which of course William proceeds to not do, you need to be able to actually tell what is the flow of energy. And we see this by, of course, William actually using all of his strength to grab the blade and strike Raian down. But Raian easily blocks that attack and mocks William again. This time taking the blade and holding it, spinning it around like it's nothing. And it is at this point in which he reveals that he can see the flow of energy. At first I thought it was pre-initiative, but it doesn't seem like that is what's happening here. Seeing the flow of energy and pre-initiative are apparently two completely different things. However, I wouldn't be surprised if these two things were actually linked in some way, because there would have to be at least a little bit of a prediction factor there. So maybe you need like basically light pre-initiative skills, but ultimately that is the means by which Raian has gotten much stronger and much better as a fighter. And it is at this point in which William's last words and the final parts of this fight are actually a parallel of the end of the fight between Mukaku versus Shen Wulong, where Mukaku was on the ground, sort of, and Shen was above him, and Shen cuts down on Mukaku. In a similar way, Raian cuts William Wu, like a direct parallel, while calling back to the fact that Raian now knows a similar technique as the Connector does. Of course, William is killed by this. He gets directly struck in the head, probably not surviving that, honestly. And he is, of course, the messenger. The message that Raian is leaving for Gilbert, which ultimately ends the chapter. And man, what an interesting chapter. Is Raian on Shen Wulong's level? Probably not. However, he seems to be approaching that level. And this is something that I've talked about, like, I think a few months ago when we were at the end of the Setsuna versus Nico fight, where I talked about how the rest of the verse is catching up to the Worm Hands and Shen Wulong. Probably, especially at this point, post chapter 250, we're approaching basically higher levels of strength here. The fact that Raian can see the flow of energy and was stopping William Wu from using his full power just goes to show that, yeah, even if he's not on the connector's level in terms of mastery, he's almost cracked that level to a certain extent. And it is the same thing that, of course, was referred to by Shen Wulong as the principles. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens and what other buffs other characters end up coming back with. Because right now it seems as though Setsuna and Raian are quite literally ahead of the pack in terms of power that they have showcased in terms of the, of course, let's say, good guys. Excluding the Worm Heads and Shen Wulong, Raian and Setsuna are about some of the strongest fighters that are on the Kengan side, sort of. But yeah, that's the video, that's the review. If you like it, don't forget to like and sub. And until next time, take it easy.